The wind howled like a grieving widow as Elias Kane, 91 years old, stood before the sagging wooden door of a house he hadn't seen since 1955. His trembling hand, gnarled by time and arthritis, hovered over the brass knocker, the weight of 7 decades pressing against his chest. He wasn't sure if it was the cold or the fear of what lay beyond that made his breath catch. Elias had been a boy of 21 when he last stood here, a soldier fresh from the war, his uniform crisp, his heart alight with promises. The world was different then, simpler, yet brutal in its own way. This house, tucked in the rolling hills of Virginia, had been a sanctuary, a fleeting dream of peace during a time when the world was tearing itself apart. He could still see her face, Lillian, with her auburn hair and eyes that held the warmth of a summer dusk. She'd stood in this very doorway, waving as he left for what he swore would be a temporary goodbye. But war and fate had other plans. The years had not been kind. Elias had survived the front lines, the jungles, the screams that never left his dreams. He'd returned to a country that moved on without him, to a life that felt like a borrowed coat never quite fitting. Lillian's letters stopped coming in '56. He'd heard she'd married, moved on, built a life without him. He couldn't blame her. He'd been a ghost, a man who carried too many shadows to hold on to love. Yet, every night for 70 years, he'd dreamed of this door, of her laughter echoing through the halls inside. He knocked. The sound was frail, swallowed by the wind, but it carried the weight of his entire life. He waited, his heart pounding like it did when he was 21, when hope was still a thing he could afford. Footsteps approached, slow, deliberate, unfamiliar. The door creaked open, and a young woman stood there, her face a stranger's, her eyes sharp with curiosity. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft but guarded. "I'm looking for Lillian," Elias said, his voice rough as gravel. "Lillian Harper. She lived here a long time ago." The woman's expression softened, but there was a flicker of something, pity, perhaps. "Lillian was my grandmother," she said. "She passed away 10 years ago." The words hit Elias like a bullet, clean and precise, piercing through the fragile hope he'd carried all these miles. He nodded, his eyes drifting to the ground, where the ghosts of his youth seemed to linger in the dirt. "I'm sorry to bother you," he managed, turning to leave. "Wait," the woman said, stepping forward. "You're Elias, aren't it? She talked about you." He froze, his cane digging into the earth. "What did she say?" "The woman Clara." She introduced herself, invited him inside. The house smelled of lavender and old wood, a scent that tugged at memories he'd buried deep. Clara led him to a sitting room, where a faded photograph sat on the mantel. Lillian, older but unmistakable, smiling beside a man Elias didn't recognize. Clara poured tea, her hands steady but her eyes searching his face. "She never forgot you," Clara said. "She kept your letters. All of them." Elias's throat tightened. "She married someone else." Clara nodded. "She did. But she always said you were her first love. She'd read your letters when she thought no one was watching. Sometimes she'd cry." He didn't know what to say. The weight of 70 years' soft wondering, of regret, was too much to unpack in a single moment. Clara stood, retrieving a small wooden box from a shelf. Inside were his letters, yellowed and brittle, tied with a faded red ribbon. "She wanted you to have these," Clara said. "She told me, years ago, that if you ever came back, I should give them to you." Elias's hands shook as he touched the box, the paper crinkling under his fingers. Each letter was a piece of the boy he'd been, the man he'd never become. He opened one, his eyes scanning the words he'd written in a foxhole, under starlight, in moments stolen from death. "I'll come back to you, Lillian. I swear it." "Why now?" Clara asked, her voice gentle but piercing. "Why come back after all this time?" Elias looked out the window, where the hills rolled on, unchanged yet foreign. "I had to know," he said. "I had to know if she remembered me." Clara smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "She did. More than you'll ever know." They talked for hours, Clara sharing stories of Lillian's life, her marriage, her children, her quiet strength. Elias listened, piecing together the life he'd missed, the one he'd let slip through his fingers. As the sun dipped below the hills, Clara offered him a guest room for the night. He declined, feeling the pull of the road, the need to keep moving. But before he left, Clara handed him a small journal from the box. This was hers, she said. She wrote about you. Elias drove to a motel that night, the journal unopened in his lap. He was afraid to read it, afraid of what it might say, afraid it might break him. But under the dim light of a flickering lamp, he opened it. Lillian's handwriting was steady, elegant, a mirror of the woman he'd loved. The first entry was dated 1956, the year her letters stopped. Elias, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to write it. I'm married today. He's a good man, but he's not you. I'll always wait for you, even if you never come. He closed the journal, tears burning his eyes. For the first time in decades, Elias Kane let himself weep. Elias woke to the sound of rain tapping against the motel window, each drop a reminder of the years he'd lost. Lillian's journal lay on the bedside table, its pages heavy with words he hadn't yet dared to read beyond the first. He felt like a soldier again, standing at the edge of a battlefield, unsure if he had the strength to charge forward. He spent the morning driving aimlessly through the Virginia countryside, the journal in the passenger seat like a silent companion. The hills were the same, yet different new houses dotted the landscape, and the old oak where he and Lillian once carved their initials was gone, replaced by a gas station. He stopped there, buying a coffee he didn't drink, staring at the spot where love had once felt eternal. The weight of Lillian's words clung to him. I'll always wait for you. Had she meant it? Or was it the fleeting hope of a young woman who didn't yet know how time could erode even the strongest promises? By noon, Elias found himself back at the house. Clara was in the garden, tending to roses that bloomed with a fierceness that reminded him of Lillian. She looked up, unsurprised, as if she'd known he'd return. Couldn't stay away, could you? She said, brushing dirt from her hands. I need to understand, Elias said, his voice low. Why she kept my letters. Why she wrote that journal. Clara invited him in again, this time leading him to the attic. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through a cracked window, and boxes of Lillian's life were stacked against the walls. Clara pulled out a photo album, its pages filled with black and white memories. There was Lillian at her wedding, her smile bright, but her eyes distant. There she was with her children, laughing in a field. And then, tucked between two pages, a photograph Elias hadn't expected. Himself, young and grinning, his arm around Lillian under that oak tree. She never let go of you, Clara said, watching his face. Not really. Elias traced the photo with a trembling finger. I should have come back sooner. Clara hesitated, then reached for another box. There's someone you should meet, she said, her tone shifting. He's been waiting to talk to you. The twist came like a gust of wind, sharp and unexpected. Clara led him downstairs, where an older man sat in the kitchen, his face weathered but kind. This is my father, Daniel, Clara said. Lillian's son. Daniel stood, his handshake firm despite the years etched into his skin. You're Elias Kane, he said, not a question but a statement. Ma talked about you my whole life. Elias felt the ground shift beneath him. Lillian's son, a man who carried her blood, her spirit, and perhaps her regrets. What did she say? Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel sat, motioning for Elias to join him. She said you were the one who got away. She said you were her courage, even when you weren't there. The words were a knife, twisting in Elias's chest. Daniel poured coffee, his hands steady but his eyes carrying a weight Elias recognized grief, unspoken and heavy. She told me about the war, Daniel continued. How you promised to come back. She waited, you know. Even after she married my father, she waited. Elias's mind reeled. He'd always imagined Lillian moving on, building a life untouched by the boy who'd left her. But Daniel's words painted a different picture, a woman who'd carried him in her heart, even as she raised a family, even as the years piled on. Why didn't she write? Elias asked. After 56, the letters stopped. Daniel's face darkened. My father, her husband, was a good man, but jealous. He found your letters, burned the ones she tried to send. She fought him on it, but he was persuasive. She wrote the journal instead, for you. Elias gripped the journal in his lap, its pages suddenly heavier. He opened it again, reading further. 1958. Elias, I saw a man in town today who looked like you. My heart stopped, but it wasn't you. I don't know if you're alive, but I pray you are. Each entry was a confession, a love letter to a ghost. Elias felt his chest tighten, the regret of decades crashing over him like a wave. Daniel leaned forward, his voice soft. She named me after you, in a way. Daniel Elias Harper. She said it was her way of keeping you close. The revelation was a quiet explosion in Elias's heart. He looked at Daniel, searching for traces of Lillian in his face, the curve of his jaw, the warmth in his eyes. It was there, faint but undeniable. For the first time, Elias felt a connection to the life Lillian had built, a bridge across the years he'd missed. They talked through the afternoon, Daniel sharing stories of Lillian's strength, her laughter, her quiet moments of sorrow. Elias shared fragments of his own life, the war, the loneliness, the nights he'd stared at the stars, wondering where she was. As the sun set, Daniel offered Elias a place to stay, but once again, Elias felt the pull of the road. He needed time to process, to carry Lillian's journal and her son's words into the night. The road stretched endless before Elias, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the Virginia night. Lillian's journal sat in the passenger seat, its pages whispering secrets he wasn't ready to face. He drove until dawn, chasing the horizon, as if he could outrun the ache in his chest. He stopped at a diner, the kind of place where the coffee was bitter and the waitresses called you Han. The journal lay open on the table, Lillian's words pulling him back to 1960. Elias, I told Daniel about you today. He's only 4, but he listened like he understood. I hope one day he'll meet you. The thought of a child carrying his name, his story, made Elias's hands tremble around his mug. He'd spent a lifetime running from this pain, but now it was catching up. Back in his car, Elias found himself heading toward the old church where he and Lillian used to sit, dreaming of a future that never came. The church was still there, its steeple leaning slightly, as if bowing to time. He parked and walked to the graveyard behind it, his cane sinking into the soft earth. He hadn't planned to come here, but something instinct maybe drew him to the rows of headstones. And there it was, Lillian Harper, 1932-2015. Beloved mother, wife, friend. Elias sank to his knees, the cold seeping through his coat. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. I should have come back. The wind carried his words away, leaving only silence. He stayed there until the sun climbed higher, reading more of the journal. 1975, Elias, I saw a newsreel about the war today. I wondered if you were still out there, fighting, or if you'd found peace. I hope you have. He was startled by a voice behind him. You knew her too? A woman, perhaps in her 60s, stood a few feet away, holding a bouquet of lilies. Her face was kind but worn, her eyes carrying a familiar spark. I'm Sarah, she said. Lillian's daughter. Another twist, another thread of Lillian's life unraveling before him. Elias stood, leaning heavily on his cane. I'm Elias Kane, he said, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. Sarah's eyes widened. You're him. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. Mama used to tell me stories about you. The soldier who promised to come back. Elias nodded, unable to speak. Sarah knelt beside the grave, placing the lilies gently on the stone. She loved you, Sarah said. Even when she was angry at you for leaving, she loved you. They sat together, sharing memories of Lillian. Sarah spoke of her mother's strength, her quiet acts of kindness, her habit of humming old war songs when she thought no one was listening. Elias shared the Lillian he'd known, the girl who'd danced with him under the stars, who'd written him letters that kept him alive through the war. Each story was a piece of a puzzle, filling in the gaps of a life Elias had only imagined. Sarah reached into her bag, pulling out a small locket. She wore this every day, she said, opening it to reveal a tiny photo of Elias, young and smiling. She said it was her way of keeping you close. Elias took the locket, his fingers brushing the worn metal. Inside, he saw himself as he'd been, hopeful, unbroken. He didn't recognize that boy anymore, but Lillian had. She'd carried him with her, through decades, through a life he'd never been part of. Why didn't she hate me? Elias asked, his voice raw. I left her. I broke my promise. Sarah smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. Mama said love doesn't work that way. She said you gave her something no one else could hope, even when it hurt. They stayed at the grave until dusk, the air growing heavy with the promise of rain. Sarah invited Elias to her home, but he declined, needing the solitude of the road. As he drove away, the locket hung around his neck, a small weight that felt like an anchor. He opened the journal again that night. reading entries from the 1980s, when Lillian wrote of growing older, of watching her children build lives of their own. Elias, I wonder if you're out there, old like me. I hope you found someone to love you the way I did. The words were a gift and a wound. Elias realized he wasn't just chasing Lillian's memory, was chasing forgiveness, for himself, for the boy who'd walked away. He didn't know if he'd find it, but for the first time in years, he wanted to try. Elias drove through the night, the locket warm against his chest, Lillian's journal open on the seat beside him. Her words had become his compass, guiding him through a past he'd tried to forget. He read an entry from 1995, Elias, I'm 63 now, and the world feels smaller. I still think of you. Of that summer we thought we'd conquer time. I hope you're happy, wherever you are. He wasn't happy, not then, not for most of his life. Elias had survived the war, but peace had eluded him. He'd worked odd jobs, lived in quiet towns, kept people at arm's length. Love had been a luxury he couldn't afford, not after Lillian. But her journal, her children, her locket were proof that his life had meant something, even if he hadn't known it. By morning, he found himself at the old bridge where he and Lillian had shared their first kiss. The river below still flowed, steady and unyielding, a witness to their youth. He sat on the bank, reading more of the journal. 2005, Elias. Daniel brought his daughter Clara to visit today. She's got your fire, your stubborn heart. I told her about you, and she listened like you were a hero. The words made Elias smile, a rare thing that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. A new voice interrupted his thoughts. You look like you're carrying the world, it said. Elias turned to see an old man, perhaps his age, fishing pole in hand, his face creased with a lifetime of stories. Name's Tom, he said, settling beside Elias. Used to know the folks who lived up at that old house on the hill. Elias's heart skipped. Lillian Harper? Tom nodded, his eyes narrowing. You're the soldier, aren't you? The one she waited for. The words were a jolt, another twist in a story that refused to stay buried. Tom lit a pipe, the smoke curling into the air. Lillian and I were friends, after her husband passed. She'd sit right here, telling me about a boy named Elias who stole her heart and never gave it back. Elias listened, spellbound, as Tom shared stories Lillian hadn't written in her journal. How she'd volunteered at the church, helping veterans like Elias, hoping one day he'd walk through the door. How she'd kept a box of his letters, reading them when the loneliness grew too heavy. She never stopped loving you, Tom said, even when it hurt her to. Elias's voice cracked. I didn't know. I thought she'd forgotten me. Tom shook his head. Some loves don't forget. They just wait. They sat in silence, the river's song filling the space between them. Tom offered Elias a fishing pole, and for a moment, they were just two old men, casting lines into the water, sharing the weight of years. Elias told Tom about the war, the nightmares, the guilt that had kept him away. Tom listened, his eyes kind but unflinching. You came back, he said. That's more than most do. As the sun dipped low, Elias felt something shift inside him, a quiet acceptance, a flicker of peace. He thanked Tom and drove back to the house, needing to see Clara and Daniel one last time. They welcomed him like family, and over dinner, they shared more stories, more laughter, more of Lillian's light. Elias gave Clara the locket, asking her to keep it safe. He gave Daniel the journal, telling him it belonged with Lillian's family. As he left, Clara hugged him, her voice soft. You gave her hope, Elias. That was enough. He drove into the night, the road stretching before him, but this time, it didn't feel so heavy. Lillian's love had been a gift, one he'd carried without knowing, one that had shaped her children, her life, her legacy. At 91, Elias Kane finally understood. He hadn't just been a soldier, a ghost, a man who'd lost his way. He'd been loved, fiercely and forever, and that was enough.